fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Okay, welcome back into the House of Mystery. We're at the interview part of the show. So joining us today is Canadian author Paul Lafferty. How are you today?
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. How are you?
Wonderful.
Good.
Delicious. Disturbed. So now let's talk about you. So how did you become a writer? Like where did it come from?
You know what? This is something like most people I've toyed about since I was a kid. I remember always writing little things down. I always remember being the kid in class who would send you a stupid note so you would crack up and be thrown out of class. And then I would be like, hey, I didn't write that. That's not mine. I've always had little ideas like that. And then from what I did for a living for all those years, you start telling people little stories or you start putting stuff out there and people say, well, that's not bad. Put it together. So I've always wanted to do the idea. And then 5-6 years ago, it started coming together. It started all falling into place. And we started with this first book with Down the Lane.
Well, but so you have some interesting things that happen in your life and people seem to like to hear the stories. How do you get the confidence to actually put it in paper, to actually write it?
So you know what? Near the end, hopefully it's something that'll come up with one of the other stories. What happened with me was, it's kind of a strange story. I started doing this job as a part-time job when I got out of university. I started working as a bouncer in a strip club. And within a couple of years, I was helping the guy who owned it run 3 different clubs. And it sounds really crazy. It's not a big rags to riches story. It's not, I was out there killing people or anything. But, within a couple of years, like I had bought a house. I had money in the bank. I had 2 cars. I had a motorcycle. I had all that done. And then when this guy went through some bad luck and the industry itself just kind of changed, all of a sudden I was back to making $500 a week. And no disrespect to anybody who's having problems with money, but it was a little hard to swallow. And I said, how did it go from this to this? Whoa, all the way back down to this.
Wait, so when you were making $500 a week, were you still with the same guy, like doing bouncing, or you were just thrown out of that business?
No, what happened was I finally decided to leave. I went to go work. Well, I guess for Canada, it's a normal job. I went to go work at a casino. I hated every second of it. And then someone else came back and said, why don't you come back and work part-time for who was our biggest rival? And maybe I was too far into how I was doing things, or maybe I was just too used to being with the one company, because I've been with them for almost 10 years, that it wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't a job for an adult. I didn't want to do it anymore. Luckily, he put me in charge of a club that nobody came to, so I just spent my nights starting to write the manuscript for this book.
So the manuscript looks back in the rearview mirror. Does it focus more on the time when you were writing high?
Yes. So then that was kind of the problem that, I was explaining to you guys earlier. It didn't really have a focus. It didn't have much of an actual story. It was more like a book of anecdotes, which I'd like to do somewhere down the line too, if people still like these ones. But the theory being with the people that I had spoken to was, probably no one is really going to buy this as is, because, nobody knows who you are. There's not much context for all of these stories. Why don't you go back and write a fictional one? So I said, okay, let's try that. And that was the end result of what came out.
Oh, so you had initially done a nonfiction version, or at least started
it's sitting in a drawer somewhere. It's a little more than half done.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. What did you prefer? So it seemed like it was hinged on more of a business decision to go fictionalized, but which one did you prefer actually writing?
To be perfectly honest, it's hard to say. The first one was from a very angry not very happy with myself and everybody around me point of view. So I'm sure if I pulled it out of the drawer now, I'd be like, oh, I was really pissed off. So this one was a little more fun because I could play with it. Of course, when you're writing when you're writing fiction, you can go over the top and you can be all crazy. So that was a little more fun to put the things in that people might say, well, that would have never happened, because I can say to them, well, yeah, that totally happened. I just had to make it fiction so nobody comes back and I get in trouble for it.
Right. Yeah, you can always revert to saying, hey, as a matter of fact, it didn't happen.
Yeah. So that was part of the problem with that. Was there was a few instances in there that I've had at least two friends call me and say, I remember having this conversation with you. And I'm like, well, it's not exactly, what we said. And they're like, no, it's pretty well exactly what we said. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
So is that exciting to work at a strip club, or is it just drab and not all it's cracked up to be, or like what was that experience?
What I always tell everybody is it was a mini version of the movie Casino.
Okay.
We finally had the point where like everybody knew who we were in the other clubs, so we would have one of two situations. We were the number 2 club in town. We were never the number 1 club in town. Our rival far outshone us, so to speak. But it finally got to the point where it was one of two things. We would go out on a Monday night and we would go to another club, or we would go somewhere else. And, it sounds really silly and pointless now, but we'd be treated like royalty. You wouldn't pay for your drinks. There'd be people sitting all over our table. There'd be people asking us for jobs. Or you had the opposite to it, which we couldn't even get in the door because people didn't want to deal with us because we were from another club. So it really gave us both sides of seeing what a small, minute little piece of fame is like. And then, all the stuff that you have to deal with in that business, law enforcement, organized crime, people who probably couldn't hold a regular job anywhere else. And then, there were other days where I make the point in the first book, and I continue it on in the second one. And some days I sat in the office and read the newspaper.
Oh, yeah, it's more mundane.
Yeah, so, there were times where it was like, oh, my God, I can't believe that happened. Or somebody would read something in the paper and say, was that you? And I would have to say, well, yeah, that was us. But a lot of other times, still, somebody's got to buy the liquor order. Somebody's got to make sure all the bills are paid. Somebody's got to make sure, the toilet isn't broken. I didn't have too many of those responsibilities. I was more dealing with the staff and how, when you came to see the show, how it ran when you were inside. But by and large, it was, there's no doubt it was fun, and it was definitely financially benefiting to me, or I wouldn't have stayed so long.
And it was, you said that was about a period of a decade where it was financially beneficial.
Oh, huge, yeah.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
We're in a very unique situation. I'm in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. And what happens is when you cross into New York State, you can have, it might have changed by now. I'm not 100% sure. But at one time, you went to a club and women did not get fully naked and you were served alcohol.
Okay.
Or you went into a club and women were fully naked, but they were not allowed to serve alcohol.
Yeah.
They were not allowed to serve alcohol. Canada is kind of known as the Wild West.
Get naked.
Get naked. And unfortunately, things I'm not too proud of, but a lot of what we let the girls get away with. So it finally came to the point where we were in a club big enough that I was responsible for between 75 and 100 girls a night.
Nice. So talk to me about what responsible means. Like, what were you exactly doing in the course of managing them?
Basically, what we had to do was my boss came up with this insane idea that he wanted a mini version of a Vegas show. So we were one of the few clubs that had more than one girl on at one time. So you could come in, and the original idea was at the one end of the club, you had a girl dancing on stage, and at the far end of the club, you had another girl dancing on stage. So my job was to match up these two girls, which sounds pretty easy, but since they all hate each other, it wasn't as easy as it sounds. And then within a couple of months, he came to us one night. He was always one of these guys who had these fantastic, huge ideas. And you would always humor him and say, yeah, that's a great idea. And then you'd never hear about it again. We were sitting down on a Saturday after a huge night, and him saying, we're not taking full advantage of what we have here. We have all these girls and we have all these things running. So we're going to have 6 girls running at the same time.
Okay.
So I was like, yeah, okay, sure. And never brought up with them again. And then I came in the Monday morning and they had built 4 other stages. So my biggest responsibility was to take the list of girls, to find 6 girls who wouldn't kill each other, and have them all go on stage. And then, of course, you know, I don't like her music. I don't like her. And well, you're not on stage with her. You're dancing at the same time she was. So basically, the biggest part of the job was to make deals with these girls to say, okay, if you go on now, like, I'll leave you alone for 2 hours. Because I don't think anybody ever thinks of the mathematics of it. Even with a DJ who talks a lot, our time span was you were putting on 4 girls an hour with little breaks and stuff in between. So if you times that by 6, a little simple math there, we've got 24 girls an hour. So even with your 75 to 100 girls and little mishaps, they're all going on we used to figure about every 2.5 hours. And I would tell them, this is your promo for people seeing you and people want to dance in the back. But then, you know, they're in the back and they don't want to come out, or they would hide, or, you know, I'd tell them they were on stage and the next thing they'd be doing is getting changed to go home. And I'm like, what are you doing? So it's just, it sounds really silly to somebody who's never done it before, but I basically had to run this show every evening.
Oh, and yeah, no, that is hard. I mean, imagining anyone is hard, and let alone in an industry that's so unconventional, you're going to have like more extreme personality types, I imagine.
And then what would happen was, most of the other management I got along with, most of the other guys were good guys, and we had things that we were responsible for. And it was always understood that this was my show, this is what I was responsible for. But you'd get the new guy who, you know, either wanted points with the boss or didn't get along with you. Well, why don't we do it this way? And then I'd always have to say, well, you know, why don't you shut up? Because I've done this for a while, and I don't really need your help. So usually it was external forces. Like everything else, I got a system of doing it. I brought in a buddy named, he was already working there, but a guy named Lee Beaupre wound up becoming a really good friend of mine who helped me do it. So we kind of played off each other. If I was the bad cop, he was the good cop. With the girls that he had to be the bad cop with, I was a good cop saying, okay, well, Lee told you this, I'll do that. So, and like everything else in the world, it has to have some kind of a system, because the original idea were the boss saying, well, you know, just leave up a sign-up sheet and they'll show up when they're supposed to. Yeah, no, that wasn't ever going to work. That was the biggest part of my job. I wasn't the money guy. I wasn't the guy who made the schedule. For lack of a better term, I was the guy responsible for who you saw naked on stage when you came in.
Right. Is that the main? That's the main frame of what you're depicting in the novel. That
this
job.
one not so much. This one I made more of the first one I made more of a crime novel.
Okay.
So we could have an actual story about it, with the bar being the backdrop. And a couple of comments that I got from other friends was that was great.
Okay, that's good. I mean, they want more.
Yeah, what a couple of people reached out and said was that was great, but all the crazy bar stories and all the stuff you said over the years, why don't you incorporate that one in? So I'm kind of trying to do a flip, and I hope I don't fall on my face with it, but basically what the second one is going to be, the gang issue and the organized crime issue is going to kind of be pushed to the backstory of the book, where the running the bar and all the craziness and telling people those stories is the main focus of this second one.
Oh, nice, interesting. And yeah, in the first one, you've got biker gangs, you got the mafia, and is that heavily fictionalized?
No.
Or is that
not at all?
Yeah, unfortunately not. Yeah. So you're
Not
dipping
at
your
all.
toe into reality.
Yeah, there was quite a few times where we had to bump up against these guys where, different words were exchanged. I got out really lucky. Most of those guys saw me as a pretty normal, harmless guy. There were some other guys that got involved with them. You know, things didn't turn out too well. They, got some pretty big drug habits, wound up going to jail, this and that. I don't want to sermonize about organized crime or anything like that. I've always been fascinated with it, but if you're the schlub in an organized crime racket, it's the same as being the schlub in life. You're not really getting too far ahead.
Right.
And it's just a lot of these guys, it's the power of saying, well, I was hanging out with so-and-so last night. And, a lot of times it doesn't turn out well for you. These guys are predators. These guys, if they're going to be friends with you in any sense, it's to see what they can get from you.
It's almost like being in prison. Like, you don't want to take anything from them. And
no, because you never know what's going to turn around. I got lucky, and I wound up meeting a couple guys that were involved that actually a couple of times said, hey, if you need help with something or these guys are bothering you, let me know. Not because I was one of them, but because I always thought that they thought I was pretty harmless and I wasn't really involved in their world. So there was a couple of times where I had to say, hey, man, like, come on, what's going on here? So, and there are other times where it didn't work out too well for me either, but.
Right, and is there...
There's so long.
Oh, got it. So their presence around the world of the strip club, how does that work exactly? Is it all tied up in mutual business interest with the strip club owner? Is it just that they hang around that sort of environment because it's a seedy kind of underground-ish environment? Or like what is that brings those elements into the fold?
I can proudly say, as much as I had problems with the old owner, and neither one of us were big fans of each other, we were one of the few clubs in our area that said, no, you guys can come in, you guys can do what you want, but you don't have any say over the business, and you definitely don't tell us what to do. He was very strong in that regard. A lot of the other clubs you would go into, it almost seemed like it was their second office. Right. They'd snap their fingers and somebody would jump to attention. He flat out told them, no, I'm not going to do that. I own this and I own this solely. And then we were basically the guys who had to enforce it, which is easier said than done. It's one thing dealing with a bunch of tough guys at the door and telling them they got to go. It's another thing dealing with 15 guys that are from, I won't name any gang, but are from a pretty powerful gang and say, oh, yeah, well, we'll be back. So
yeah, I was going to say, because it's not just easy to say, stay away from me, because it's in the nature of criminals, they're not going to want to listen. So it had to be an ongoing source of pressure.
Well, nobody can lose face is the way I always try and describe it. And the difference was I had to lose face without totally bending over backwards for them, and they had to lose face. They couldn't lose face by making it look like I was telling them what to do. So it was a really hard balancing act that I didn't always do very well, but we did have some other guys, some of the guys that I mentioned before, that were much tougher than I was, that helped. It was definitely a team effort to there was no way to get rid of them. They were going to be there. Those guys hang out there all the time. That's the kind of thing they like, but we definitely kept it out of the business end. But then the problem is you get guys who want to individually deal with them, or guys who get favors from them or buy drugs from them, and that's when things start getting messed up.
Right. Now talk to me. I'm interested also, especially because you're a writer, this makes you atypical as a writer, and you're the sort of writer I really like for this reason, is that you are tough. I'm just curious about how that goes, because obviously to be a writer, you're also sensitive and thoughtful and philosophical, but then you have to be in this role, you have to be tough every day. I'm wondering if that takes exertion, if it's stressful, or if it's just part of the nature of who you are. Like, how would you describe that?
I think it's just a little bit me. I'm 5'10", I'm 230, and maybe I still carry that look from the bar and stuff, but you see people get intimidated or walk away from you sometimes, where I feel like I have to take the pains and say, no, I'm not a bad guy. I'm not a bad guy. You don't want to be too intimidating. It's kind of a mix. I would never view myself as a tough guy. I would never view myself as, as somebody who wants to go out intimidating other people. But it is kind of a difference. There are some experiences that I've talked about with other people where they said, like, how did you do that? And I said, it was my job. Is what we I mean, there's a certain level you have to operate on where you have, especially to be a bouncer. And I know the job became much more complicated, but you have to be able to wield your intimidation and deal with people. Luckily, like I said, I was always kind of known. If we had to fight, I would. There were times where, I will readily admit it. There were guys that were much tougher than I was, and I would just say, you know what, we can't deal with these guys. We have to get rid of them. And unfortunately, sometimes that didn't turn out in our favor either. But it's funny when you try and explain it to people, because they get this dead-eyed look that I was a sheriff walking through town shooting people. Not at all. I made a lot of deals with a lot of people to keep the peace and to have things run properly.
Got it. Okay.
How do you determine what you're going to put in? Because you say it's not so fictional and a lot of it is kind of real. So how do you determine what stories you're going to put in and what about the story you're going to put in?
What I basically did was I came up with a theory for the first book about basically what it is longtime friends of mine who are in one gang have decided to move up into the big time, so to speak. And I kind of show it from their lens and how it affects everybody around us. Being that, I don't know how much you guys follow this, but I've seen this before. I've read about this before. The one big thing that happened in Ontario in the mid to late 90s was the Hells Angels decided they were coming to Ontario. If you follow the outlaw biker scene at all, these guys for years have been known as the gold standard. These guys are the top of the top. They take who they want, and they're historically very hard to deal with. What happened with us was things became a shambles in Ontario. And I took little side pieces of that to push the story along. That there are two main characters in the book that decide that they're going to go with a bigger gang. And it kind of turns out for one guy, it doesn't turn out for the other guy, which I thought made it a little more realistic that, I didn't want a downer, horrible ending to the story, but I didn't want to everybody lives happily ever after either because, neither one of them happened. I mean, they do happen, but not a lot.
Did you have some sort of a goal in the fact of what people get out of the book? So when someone reads your book at the end of it, other than the story or some of the things in the book, was there another purpose or another thing you were trying to get across to the reader?
I don't want to get up on my high horse here, or my soapbox, or whatever you want to call it, but people can definitely change things. Luckily, I came from a great family my father stepped in about 12 years ago and said, what are you doing? Like, you want to wake up and be a 40-year-old bouncer? Like, do you want to worry about, people waiting for you after work? Why don't you go back to school? I had already had a BA in politics. I said, why don't you go back and become a teacher and a writer? It's what you always wanted to do anyway. And I said, how am I going to do that now? I have a house, I have responsibilities, I have things to take care of. And he stepped in. Him and my mom had done fairly well financially. He said, I will pay for you to go back to school as long as you take care of all of your other things. So that was what set everything in motion, and just to show that people can change. I think a lot of people in everyday life, are trapped. It was a hard slog. I still had to work here and there. I still, you felt like a bum because I had to go. By this time, unfortunately, my dad never got to see the success, but I would have to go to my mom and say, can I have $300? Like, I got to pay this bill. But it was working towards a goal. So I think if I'd like to get anybody out of anything, that, you can change this, you can improve it. The whole 20th century idea that we are, or 21st century now, going into this century, that we are defined by our jobs, I think it's just insane. It seems to be the biggest part of everybody's personality that, this is what you do for a living. So, I can't believe he went and did that. He's a businessman. He interviews people on the internet. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Almost everyone alive has so many different facets to them that other people wouldn't see.
Yeah, I think also in this century, it's, especially in my generation, so many people switch careers so often that it sort of exposes the lie you're talking about. Because I know people that have done like an array of different things and they've done them all well. It's like, oh, right, because you're human and you can apply your skills and talents to this or that. So it doesn't have to be hyper specialized. And that is a really good perspective, because I can get caught up in that and having to deprogram from like, I am a writer, or no, what am I? I'm a filmmaker. No, what am I? I'm on the radio. How does it look? Or I'm a journalist. And like it often seems like a mess, but at a certain point, it's like, I got to try and go with the flow.
To give you a personal example, I idolized my father. My father just seemed to be one of those guys who always did the right thing, had 4 kids, was with my mom. It would have been 50 years had he made it through his sickness. But my dad was a windstorm. My dad had no problem having a couple of beers. My dad had no problem telling you when you were pissing him off or you were doing the wrong thing. But he had so many facets to him. And he'd been a truck driver for his whole career. He'd had other opportunities where he could have moved into the office and he could have done things, but he did very well being a Teamster, and he stayed with driving the truck right till he retired. And every now and then people would come over and, they'd see him with a pile of books, or they'd talk to him and they'd say, what does your dad do for a living? And he's a truck driver. No, come on, what does he really do?
Yeah.
So, was he defined by driving that truck? Absolutely not. But it's what allowed him to live the way he did. And they were quite comfortable after he retired. So I'd kind of like to do, I'd like to do the same thing in my own way. I enjoy my teaching and I enjoy my writing, but is this fully everything I'm ever going to do? I would hope not.
Yeah, it's a really healthy point of view, because it keeps you like fertile, expansive. You're not. I think it's very, very easy to become obsessive about your vocation, and like you said, let it define you. And it's like it has to be the nature of every single thing you're doing or expressing, and that gets really stale.
It does, and when your job, again, like, not to put down what he did for a living, it's why I'm where I am. But would you really come home and obsess about your truck 24 hours a day? Would you really be worried about what the other guys were doing when you weren't there? No, like, that was his job, and he went in. And I remember him doing extremely long hours when we were kids, and sometimes he went on the road briefly, and you wouldn't see him for 3 or 4 days. But then he decided that that wasn't a family life, so he made the choice to stay home. And in between that, we didn't hear about the trucking industry. We didn't hear about, when he had to go on strike. I'm sure there was some huge issues that came up like they always do between relationships, but we never saw any of that. So I'd kind of like to do the same thing in my own life. Like, is this what I'm doing? Yeah. And right now I'm kind of digging it, but I've got my problems too. So, hey, it all fits into the same glass, I guess.
Yeah, at some point you may pivot. You never know.
Yeah, you might go back to stripping.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. I was, it's funny because still the most recent one was probably about 3 months ago, where the guy that I started with said, if things are really down, unfortunately we can't do it now because I don't know how situations are in lockdowns where you guys are, but I have to watch the news when I'm done with you guys. Supposedly because no one's paying attention, we're going into even stricter lockdown at the end of the month. Okay. So I feel bad for the guys who decided to stay in the business because now, when did they shut everything down? They shut everything down in the spring, and then they let you briefly reopen, and then they shut everything down again. Some of these guys haven't worked for 6 months. So, it's pretty tight on your wallet.
Oh, man, yeah.
Yeah. Well, does that affect your writing?
It might, but it won't for now because I had an idea of how the second one wanted to be. I'm actually not used to being home as much as this because I was always a guy who went out, or I was always a guy who had something to do, and it's affected my personal life a little bit. But I mean, nothing is insurmountable right now. I would definitely not say I'm one of those people who are miserable, but as Eric and I talked about politics the first time we met, I guess the older I get, I'm kind of trying to veer in the middle. That being too far to one side, either side, just isn't compatible with my personality. If other people want to do that or be that stringent about something, that's fine. But I don't feel that it suits me at all.
Well, yeah, but so I just wonder. So now, when you're doing these books, where do you get your characters from then?
Again, some people are based solely on people I knew, composites. There's one guy who takes every opportunity to tell everybody he was based on one of the characters. He's really proud about it. But what I've tried to do more and more with the story is going forward now, I'm trying to make it a little more fictional. The main character is obviously based on me, and there are quite a few people in there that other people would recognize. But it's just I saw enough of how people that I had to deal with work with. I'd like to make things a little more fictionalized because I really don't want to hurt anybody with this either. I can't believe how many authors I see, you took the petty way out of naming this guy because he was some guy who made fun of you in grade 4 and stuff. I don't need that. Yeah. I don't need that at all.
Well, so where do you think you're going to draw these, because these characters, so they're not really the person you're thinking of. Like you have someone in mind, but you want to make them independent of that person, the real person. So where do you think you're going to draw that from?
I easily have 25 years of being in that business to rely on it. Even after I left the strip clubs, I went to go work at the biggest nightclub in town. And by the time I left, I pretty well became the old guy. I was the guy that they would come, and say, well, what do you think of this or what do you think of that? I was never the guy in charge, but I didn't have to do the grunt work that the young guys did, but I never had to do anything too forceful. So I still met all kind of people over the years. So there's a well from 2015 till about maybe 3 years ago, still the draw on for people to kind of make these characters about.
So what's your practices of writing? How do you do it? Like, are you doing? Did you sit down and just go? Do you assign times, or does it have to be at a certain time?
The biggest argument seems to be everywhere now that are you a planner or are you a pantser? And I'm definitely a pantser. I have those couple of ideas in my head. Yeah, I hate relying on everybody else's cliches, but I'm definitely a pantser. I have that thing in my head, but you're not going to come into my little office and find, charts of, well, why would the character do this and what's his motivation? I've had the ideas, but to me, what's worked so far, especially for the first one, it's struggling a little bit for the second one because it's not as new. I just sit down and start writing. And then if I have to go back and edit it, then we'll edit it. If I have to go back and change things. But the planning it hasn't been a big part of it, which is kind of the total opposite of what I have to do when I'm teaching. So I don't know. It's worked for me so far. I really don't want to change it. For somebody who has to write an entire 4 or 5 pages to explain what your character's about or what his motivation would be or his backstory, that's fine. But to me, let's just sit down and write this, and we can always go back and change it. Nothing is ever written in stone. So if it's bad, we change it. If it's good, we keep it in.
So
yeah, I always feel that with backstory and motivation, human beings are eternal. So I feel like in my process, the best thing to revert to is your instinct, because your intuition is going to sort of capture that poetic note of the eternal nature of a given person more than writing 5 pages about their backstory ever could. So it seems like,
nobody is going to come up with something new at this point. It's just not going to happen. I've had the privilege of having people from both sides of the fence in law enforcement saying, no, that's pretty well how it turns out. So I'd like to think I'm on the right track. If things
it's just using your instinct.
Yeah, if things get too over the top, well, that's also because it's fiction. But I was always a little negative, and one of those guys that would never happen. Well, okay, maybe it wouldn't happen, but I'm writing a book, so I can write whatever the hell I want. But yeah, I don't know, the whole over planning and all that. Again, if it works for some people, great. I'd like to think I'm a little more meticulous when I'm writing out my teachings, but for the book, it just doesn't work for me. You're not going to come in here and find, manuscripts and full of note paper. The first book was probably rewritten twice with the help of Jerry Langton saying, take this out or this wouldn't fit here, or having the mistake of being new and, all of a sudden I tried to jump into speaking in first person, second person, third person. No, pick one and leave it. Little things like that. I think the structure is much more important than what you actually put down on the page for me at this point.
Do you feel that being more spontaneous in terms of what you put down on the page, does that help you make it more emotional? Does it give it more of an aliveness?
It makes it a little more emotional for me. I don't know if other people will see that, but again, just this whole too much planning is just, I don't know. It's not me. And I don't know. I would always, one thing that I tried to do with the first book that hopefully will carry into the second book is I just, from the minute this book starts, I want people not to be able to catch their breath, just to see how crazy this whole lifestyle was. So to do that and plan out and have a big scene where, I'm getting dressed in the morning, man, a lot of times I woke up in the clothes from the night before and I had 10 minutes to get out the door and get back to work. So, big scenes about, well, I laid out my tie and I got a good shape. To me, that doesn't help my story.
Yeah,
so I would rather it be a lot more spontaneous.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension. I'm holding the book in my hands right now. There's definitely a tangible sense of tension and authenticity. And I think you describing your process, that you're not so much caught up in the planning, but it's more those structural choices, that definitely pays off.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy because, again, saying, from the teaching and saying from what my job was in the bar, I was the guy who had to plan all the stuff. And guys would always grab it and say, no, man, do it like this. And say, please, trust me. I know what I'm doing here. Just let me take care of this. So it's kind of, I don't know, the antithesis, I guess, to say how it's going. But it worked really well for the first one. And again, hate trotting out the old cliches, but I've always been a firm believer of, A, you don't reinvent the wheel, and, B, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Leave it the way it is until we have to go back and change it.
Nice.
Do you have any influences like that you read? Any writers?
I wouldn't say any one specific one. Jerry Langton, has been a huge influence in basically, my big problem with crime stories is that there's usually one of two things. And I don't know if this is still the effect from Hunter S. Thompson and all those crazy rebels from the late 60s, early 70s, but everybody seems to want to insert themselves into the story.
Yeah.
Or they want to kind of stop and give you a comment about it. Or the flip side to it is, especially with organized crime, people are either glorifying what these guys are doing, or people are, just using it as an instance to take shots at them. They're such losers, and they'd never be able to get a regular job. Some of these guys I met were brilliant. They just happened to be criminals. That's what they did for a living. And I guess what I always liked about Jerry's style of writing, I've got all his books here up on the small bookshelf, is just he was telling you the story. There was enough research done there that he could validate and back up what he was saying. There are some other Canadian crime authors. I read a lot of Yves Levine's book. He's well known for writing books. He's well known about writing about the Hells Angels and that. And up until this point, up until then, it was just, before it was fiction, I just always dug whenever I could get myself in terms of fictional books. I never went the everybody considers it blasphemy, but I never went the Stephen King route. I read all the Mario Puzo stuff because it was organized crime. I read Dean Koontz for a while, those kind of things. I enjoy a book that I can breeze through, but I also enjoy something that I have to stop and think about. The subject matter might be something that I've never personally dealt with. So it's a little all over the map.
Okay. So now, how do people find you? Do you have a website or?
For now, my biggest ones, the one that seems to be the most helpful, if you go on Facebook, I'm under my real name, under Paul Lafferty. That will lead you to the pages, which have the Down the Lane book page, you have the Down the Lane author page. I'm trying to put a blog together, but what happened was what we were talking about before we turned on the interview. I just recently got picked up by Crossroads Press. So they're going to be taking the first book, re-releasing it, and they're going to be doing the audiobook and all that stuff. For now, if anybody wants to look it up, your best bet would be to go downthelanebook.com. All one big word, which leads us to Amazon and other sites where you can buy the book. And if you're looking for what new stuff I'm working on right now or what I'm doing, I'm also on Twitter at Down the Lane Book. Twitter seems to be, for me, the most palatable of the platforms. It seems to be where I'm having the most fun. I'm not, putting my personal life into it. I'm not putting other things into it. I'm not getting sidetracked. It's about the book. So those would be the best ones. But people could definitely start with downthelanebook.com. They bring you right to Amazon. Then you can see the reviews that are out there and decide if this is something that is for you.
Fantastic. We'll have that on our site as well.
That'd be great.
We interrupt our programming. This is a national emergency. Important details will follow.
Are you prepared? Legacy Food Storage. The best way to protect your family is by being prepared. Go now to legacyfoodstorage.com. Use coupon code HOM15 now for 15% off. Quick, go!
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.